Welcome in, everyone. Ready to dig into something different today.
Always up for an adventure. What are we diving into?
Paraguayan literature.
Okay, color me intrigued. Not exactly your typical beach read, though.
Definitely not. But that's what makes it so fascinating. We're going to be uncovering hidden gems.
I'm all ears. Tell me more.
Well, we're going to be exploring how this country's literature has been shaped by some pretty intense history. Exile, dictatorships, the whole shebang.
Sounds heavy.
It is, but it's also incredibly powerful. We've got excerpts from a book called Paraguay, Novel in Exile, by Teresa Méndez-Faith as our guide.
Okay, so Méndez-Faith is like our Sherpa, leading us through this literary landscape.
Exactly. And trust me, it's a landscape worth exploring. Because to truly get Paraguayan literature, you need to understand the world it came from.
A world deeply marked by conflict. Méndez-Faith makes that very clear. She doesn't let you off the hook with just pretty words on a page. You have to dig into the context, the history.
And that history is, well, intense is an understatement, right?
To say the least.
So, for those of us who might not be walking history books, can you give us the crash course on Paraguay's tumultuous past? What events really left their mark, set the stage for this whole literary movement we're about to explore?
Okay, buckle up. We're going back in time, late 1800s, the War of the Triple Alliance. It decimated Paraguay. Just absolutely decimated the population. The trauma from that war echoed for decades.
Wow, I'm already feeling the weight of history here.
Then fast forward a bit, 1930s, the Chaco War, another brutal conflict. More scars on a nation already reeling.
Okay, so we're talking about a country that has been through the ringer not once but twice. And I'm guessing this is where the dictatorships come in.
Sadly, yes. It's a pattern we see sadly often in history. When a country is unstable, when there's fear, when people are desperate, it creates an opening for authoritarianism to take hold. And that's what happened in Paraguay.
And these dictators, they weren't exactly known for their love of free speech, were they?
Let's just say they weren't handing out any freedom of the press awards. Dissent was dangerous. Speaking out could cost you your freedom, even your life. So intellectuals, writers especially, they were living in a cage.
Trapped.
Exactly. And for many, the only way out was exile. They had to flee Paraguay, seek refuge beyond its borders, just to be able to breathe, to write freely.
And that experience, that forced displacement, that becomes a defining characteristic of modern Paraguayan literature, right? Like, it's impossible to separate the art from the political reality.
100%. These writers are carrying their homeland with them, but also the pain of its loss. Méndez-Faith, she argues that for many, it wasn't just about crossing a physical border. It was about internal exile, to the feeling of being silenced even in your own country.
So even if you weren't physically forced to flee, you could still feel exiled, silenced, trapped.
Exactly. And two of the biggest names in Paraguayan literature, Gabriel Casaccia and Augusto Roa Bastos, they both explored this idea of exile, both internal and external, in their work.
Casaccia and Roa Bastos, two literary giants, from what I understand. But from the excerpts we have, they seem like total opposites in terms of the writing style.
You're right, they're like two sides of the same coin. Casaccia was all about diving deep into the psychology of exile, the isolation, the despair, the way it messes with your mind, your sense of self. He was a master of symbolism and allegory. Like in his novels La Babosa, La Llaga, and Los Exiliados, those titles alone are evocative.
I was just thinking that, the slug, the wound, the exiles.
Right, you can already feel the weight, the darkness just from the titles. And in those books, his characters are always bumping up against these walls, both physical and metaphorical, struggling with this feeling of being trapped.
Okay, so we've got Casaccia, the psychological explorer, painting these intricate, nuanced portraits of exile. Then we have Roa Bastos. Now, he seems like he's working on a much larger canvas, wouldn't you say?
Oh, absolutely. Roa Bastos wasn't afraid to tackle the big, messy, controversial stuff head on. He'd weave real historical figures and events right into his fiction. He wasn't playing around.
Yeah, he seems fearless. And speaking of fearless, we have to talk about You El Supremo, his novel that actually brings a dictator to life. I mean, that's a bold move, right?
Talk about bold. He doesn't shy away from the controversy at all. He dives right in.
So who is this supreme he's writing about?
That would be José Gaspar Rodriguez de Francia, Paraguay's first dictator.
A real historical figure.
Wow.
And Robastos just goes there.
He goes there. But here's the thing. He doesn't just portray Francia as this one-dimensional tyrant. He gives him depth, shows his complexities as a human being, lets us hear Francia in his own words.
How did he do that?
Through letters, decrees, all these documents that blur the line between past and present. It's like he's giving Francia a platform, letting him speak from beyond the grave.
Now, that is a power move for an author. So we have these two literary heavyweights, both exiles, both grappling with Paraguay's turbulent past. But earlier you mentioned internal exile. Can you unpack that a little more? It seems crucial to understanding this whole literary landscape.
It is crucial. It's about that feeling of being silenced, of living in fear, even within your own country. Imagine living under a dictatorship where every word, every thought is potentially dangerous. You might not be physically exiled, but you're living in this constant state of self-censorship, of holding back, of never truly being free.
Trapped by invisible walls.
Exactly. And both Casacha and Roa Bastos, they capture this feeling of being suffocated, of yearning for freedom, but not knowing where to find it, even within your own heart. Their characters are always bumping up against these invisible barriers, longing for something more, something just out of reach.
It's like they're taking all that pressure, all that turmoil, and turning it into art. But they weren't just writing from a place of personal experience, right? It seems like they saw their art as a way to fight back, to resist what was happening in Paraguay.
Absolutely. You hit the nail on the head. It was art as a weapon, art as a form of resistance, especially when so many voices were being silenced.
Right, like when the government controls what you can say out loud, art becomes this secret language, a way to get the truth out there.
Exactly. And under a dictatorship, books, stories, they become dangerous. But that danger also makes them powerful, right? It's like holding up a mirror to those in charge saying, look, this is what you're doing. This is the reality you've created.
And both Casacha and Roa Bastos were masters at wielding that mirror, weren't they? They weren't afraid to use their art to make a statement.
Not at all. They saw it as their duty, their responsibility.
So how did they actually weave that resistance into their work? What were some of the techniques they used?
Well, Casacha, he was a master of subtlety. He'd embed social commentary into his narratives, but in a way that wasn't preachy or heavy-handed.
So don't tell.
Exactly. He was a master of showing, like in La Babosa, he doesn't come right out and say, this town is a microcosm of everything wrong with Paraguay. Instead, he lets you experience it, feel it in your gut.
So the town itself becomes a symbol.
Exactly. It's like this living, breathing representation of the corruption, the decay, the moral rot that was eating away at Paraguayan society under the dictatorship.
And he uses similar techniques in his other works, right? Like La Llaga and Los Exiliados.
Absolutely. He's always exploring these themes of entrapment, of being silenced, of searching for freedom in a world that feels increasingly claustrophobic.
But even though his work is subtle, it's still incredibly powerful, isn't it? Like he's trusting the reader to connect the dots, to see the bigger picture.
Exactly. He's not spoon-feeding you anything. He respects his readers enough to let them draw their own conclusions. And then you have Roa Bastos, who takes a very different approach.
Yeah, he was much more direct, right? Like a sledgehammer compared to Casacha's scalpel.
You could say that. Roa Bastos, he was all about confronting the powers that be head-on. He wasn't afraid to name names, to call out injustice, to challenge the official narrative.
And Hijo de Hombre, that's a prime example of that, right? It's like he's reclaiming history from the ground up.
Exactly. He's saying, forget the history books, forget what they've told you. This is the real story of Paraguay, the story of the people who suffered, who were silenced, who were forgotten.
And of course, there's Yo Supremo, where he literally gives a voice to the most controversial figure in Paraguayan history, José Gaspar Rodríguez de Francia.
Right. Talk about a power move. To not just write about a dictator, but to get inside his head, to humanize him. I mean, it's a risky move as an author.
Risky, but also incredibly effective, wouldn't you say?
Yeah.
It forces the reader to confront the complexities of history, the gray areas, the fact that even dictators were once human beings with their own motivations and contradictions.
100%. He's challenging us to think critically, to question our assumptions, to not fall into the trap of easy answers or simplistic narratives.
So we have these two literary titans, both exiles, both using their art as a form of resistance, but in such different ways. It's fascinating how their individual styles reflect their personalities, their worldviews.
And it speaks to the power of literature, right? That it can be this incredibly versatile tool, a way to explore the human condition from so many different angles.
Now, all of this talk about resistance, it makes you wonder, did their words ever reach back into Paraguay? Did they have an audience within the country they were forced to flee?
It's a great question, and it speaks to the power of ideas, to the resilience of the human spirit. Even though their books were banned, their names whispered in fear, their words found a way.
So it was like this underground movement, this literary resistance network.
You got it. Through clandestine networks, Smuggled copies, whispers late at night, their stories found their way back into Paraguay. And for those who were living under the dictatorship, those words were like a lifeline, a reminder that they weren't alone.
It's amazing to think about these exiled writers, their words traveling across borders through layers of censorship and fear to reach the people who needed them most.
It's a testament to the power of literature to transcend boundaries, to connect with people on a deeply human level, regardless of distance or circumstance.
And their work didn't just resonate within Paraguay, right? They eventually found an international audience as well.
Exactly, and that was huge. It brought international attention to what was happening in Paraguay, gave a voice to the voiceless on a global stage. Suddenly the world was watching, listening, paying attention to the plight of a small country that had been silenced for far too long.
So in a way, their exile, while undeniably tragic, also became this opportunity to amplify their message, to reach a wider audience, have an even greater impact on the world.
You could say that. Sometimes being forced to the margins can actually give you a clearer view of the center, you know?
That's a really interesting way to look at it. And I think it speaks to the resilience of these writers, their ability to turn adversity into opportunity.
Exactly. They took their pain, their displacement, and turned it into something powerful, something meaningful, something that continues to resonate with readers to this day.
Now, we've talked a lot about the big picture stuff, exile, resistance, the power of words. But Méndez-Faith also digs into something really interesting, the role of memory in all of this.
Oh, absolutely. Memory is a huge theme in both Casacha and Roa Bastos' work. But it's not just about the past, is it? It's about how memory shapes our present, our understanding of the world, even our future.
Right, like those old family photo albums we all have tucked away. We don't just look at them for nostalgia. They tell us something about who we are, where we come from.
Exactly. And for Casacha and Roa Bastos, those photo albums are filled with images of exile, of dictatorship, of a homeland lost. And those images, they stay with you, they haunt you, they shape the way you see the world.
So it's like those memories become part of you, part of your DNA almost.
That's a great way to put it. And both of these writers, they were masters at capturing that feeling, the way the past can linger, can whisper to the present, can shape our understanding of who we are.
Okay, so how do they actually do that? How do they take this abstract idea of memory and turn it into something we can feel on the page?
Well, let's start with Casacha. For him, memory is often tied to specific places, objects, even smells. It's about evoking a feeling, an atmosphere, a sense of being haunted by the past.
It's like he's painting with sensory details, drawing the reader into that world, those memories.
Exactly. He wants you to feel the weight of those memories, the way they can cling to you, suffocate you even.
So for Casacha, memory is often a heavy thing, a burden.
It can be, but it can also be a source of strength, a way to connect with your roots, to hold on to your identity in a world that's trying to erase it. And then you have Roa Bastos, who takes a very different approach to memory.
Right, he's less about the individual, more about the collective, the historical.
Exactly. For him, memory is about connecting generations, weaving together individual stories to create this tapestry of shared experience.
So it's like he's creating this chorus of voices, all these different perspectives on the past, showing us that history is never simple, never one-sided.
Precisely. And in Yol Supremo, he takes that idea to a whole other level by literally giving a voice to a dead dictator. It's like he's saying whose story gets told, who gets to control the narrative of the past.
It's about reclaiming those lost narratives, giving voice to the silenced, right?
Exactly. And by doing so, he's not just rewriting history, he's challenging us to think critically about how history is written, who gets to write it, and whose voices are often left out.
It's a powerful message, and I think it speaks to the importance of engaging with literature from different cultures, different backgrounds, different perspectives, because it challenges our assumptions, broadens our understanding of the world.
100%. And I think that's something that both Casacha and Roa Bastos, despite their different styles, were deeply committed to doing, challenging us to think differently, to see the world through new eyes.
Now, we've talked about how memory shapes our understanding of the past, but Méndez-Faith also argues that it can be a source of warning, even a call to action. What does she mean by that?
She's saying that by remembering the mistakes of the past, by confronting the injustices that led to exile, to dictatorship, we can avoid repeating them in the future.
So it's not just about dwelling on the past, it's about learning from it, growing from it, using it to create a better future.
You got it. It's about recognizing the patterns, the warning signs, and saying, we're not going to let this happen again. And both Casacha and Roa Bastos, in their own ways, were sounding that alarm.
Right, like they're saying, don't look away, Pay attention. Remember.
Exactly. They're reminding us that the fight for freedom, for justice, it's never truly over. It's something we have to be vigilant about, something we have to actively work towards every single day.
And they saw literature as a powerful tool in that fight, right? A way to raise awareness, to challenge the status quo, to inspire change.
Absolutely. They believed in the power of words to change hearts and minds, to move people to action. And I think their work continues to do that today.
Now, all of this really makes you think about the legacy of these writers, doesn't it? They're not just important figures in Paraguayan literature. They're voices that transcend borders, that speak to anyone who has ever felt the sting of exile, the weight of oppression.
You're right. They remind us that literature is not confined to a particular time or place. Their stories, their struggles, their triumphs, they resonate with readers around the world, especially those who are still fighting for freedom, for justice, for the right to tell their own stories.
So their legacy lives on, not just in their books, but in the hearts and minds of readers who find solace, inspiration, and even call to action in their words.
Exactly. And they remind us that even in the face of adversity, the human spirit can endure, that art can be a weapon against tyranny, and that the fight for freedom is a story that will never truly end.
Now, we've covered a lot of ground today, from the history of exile in Paraguay to the unique styles of Casacha and Roa Bastos, and how they used memory and language to craft these powerful, enduring works of art. But Méndez-Faith makes another intriguing point about the impact of exile on the writers themselves, on their creative process.
She argues that exile, while undeniably traumatic, also forced these writers to confront their own identities, their relationship to language, their place in the world in a whole new light.
So it's like exile, as awful as it was, also became this unexpected wellspring of creativity.
Exactly. It pushed them to experiment, to find new ways to express their experiences, to give voice to the voiceless. And sometimes, being forced outside of your comfort zone can lead to incredible artistic breakthroughs.
Can you give us some specific examples of how exile influenced their writing styles or the themes they explored?
Well, look at Casacha's use of symbolism and allegory. That wasn't just a stylistic choice, it was a reflection of the fragmentation and disorientation of exile itself. His characters often feel lost, unmoored, searching for meaning in a world that no longer makes sense.
Like their sense of reality has been shattered.
Exactly, and that's a common experience for anyone who's ever been forced to leave their home to start over in a new place where the rules are different, the language is different, even the air smells different.
So exile becomes this lens through which they see the world. It's not just something they write about, it's woven into the very fabric of their being.
I think that's a beautiful way to put it. And for Roa Bastos, exile intensified his fascination with history, with digging into the roots of Paraguay's problems.
It's like he was searching for answers in the past, trying to understand how his homeland had ended up in such a mess.
Exactly. And you see that reflected in his work, the way he uses historical figures, the way he experiments with language, the way he challenges official narratives. It all stems from this deep-seated need to make sense of his own displacement, his own search for belonging.
So for both of these writers, exile wasn't just a physical journey, it was an intellectual and emotional one as well.
Absolutely. It was a journey of self-discovery, of wrestling with their own demons, of finding their voice in a world that tried to silence them.
Now, we've talked a lot about the writers, their styles, their motivations. But I'm also curious about the role of the reader in all of this. How does Méndez-Faith see the reader engaging with these texts, especially given the complex historical and political context?
Well, Méndez-Faith is a big believer in active reading. She doesn't want us to just passively consume these texts. She wants us to wrestle with them, to question them, to be aware of the historical baggage, the layers of meaning, the political subtext that informs every word.
So it's not just about enjoying the story, it's about understanding the context, the weight of what these writers are trying to convey.
Exactly. She wants us to grapple with the complexities, to recognize that there's always more than one side to every story, especially when it comes to exile and dictatorship.
So it's about being a critical reader, an informed reader, and maybe even a little uncomfortable at times.
Oh, yeah, definitely. Because these texts, they're not always going to be easy to digest. They're going to challenge your assumptions, make you question your own biases. But that's a good thing, right? That's how we grow.
It's about expanding our horizons, opening ourselves up to new perspectives.
Exactly. And that's what makes literature so powerful, so vital. It allows us to step outside of our own limited experiences and connect with the wider world to develop empathy and understanding for those who are different from us.
Now, that's a powerful message, and it really speaks to the importance of engaging with literature from different cultures, different backgrounds, different perspectives. But Mendez-Faith also highlights something really fascinating about the role of language itself in this whole discussion. It's like she's saying language can be both a cage and a key, right?
I love that you picked up on that. It's such a crucial point. For writers in exile, language can be this double-edged sword. On the one hand, it's their tool, their weapon, their way of connecting with the world. But it can also be a painful reminder of what they've lost, of the distance between them and their homeland.
So it's this bittersweet thing. It's how they express themselves, but it can also be a source of pain.
Exactly. And it's even more complicated when you consider that both Casacha and Roa Bastos, even though they were writing in Spanish, which was the language of the oppressor in many ways, they found subtle ways to weave in elements of Guarani, the indigenous language of Paraguay.
So it's like they're sneaking in these little pieces of home, these linguistic breadcrumbs.
Yes. It's such a clever form of resistance, a way of saying, you can take us away from Paraguay, but you can't take Paraguay away from us. And it creates this secret connection with readers who understand those nuances, those hidden layers of meaning.
It's like a secret handshake, a way of signaling their cultural identity, their defiance, even within the confines of a language that's been imposed upon them.
Exactly. It's brilliant. And it speaks to the ingenuity of these writers, how they found ways to subvert expectations, to challenge the status quo, even within the confines of language itself.
Now, we've talked a lot about the challenges these writers faced, but Mendez-Faith also suggests that there was a certain freedom that came with writing from exile. It seems counterintuitive, doesn't it? You'd think being cut off from your homeland would be creatively stifling.
You'd think so, wouldn't you? But sometimes distance can give you clarity. It can help you see things from a new perspective. And in the case of Casacha and Roa Bastos, I think exile gave them a certain creative freedom that they might not have had if they were still living under the thumb of the dictatorship.
So it's like they were physically exiled, but intellectually emancipated.
That's a perfect way to put it. They could finally breathe, creatively speaking. They didn't have to worry about censors looking over their shoulders, about every word they wrote being scrutinized, analyzed, potentially used against them.
They were free to write their truth, to experiment, to push boundaries.
And you can see that in their work. There's a boldness, a fearlessness that I'm not sure would have been possible if they were still living under the watchful eye of the dictatorship.
So, in a way, exile became this strange gift, this opportunity to break free from the constraints of their homeland and forge their own path, both literally and figuratively.
It's a bittersweet gift, for sure. But it's a gift nonetheless. And I think both Casacha and Roa Bastos made the most of it. They took that pain, that displacement, that longing, and turned it into art that continues to inspire and challenge readers around the world.
Now, we've covered a lot of ground today, from the impact of exile on Paraguayan literature to the ways in which Casacha and Roa Bastos used their art as a form of resistance, and how their work continues to resonate with readers around the world. But we've reached the point in our deep dive where we need to start bringing things to a close. So to bring this all together, what are the key takeaways you want our listeners to walk away with today?
Oh, that's a tough one. We've covered so much ground. But I think the biggest takeaway is the power of literature, right? To give voice to the voiceless, to challenge injustice, to keep hope alive even in the darkest of times.
So it's about recognizing that literature isn't just entertainment. It's a force for change, a way to connect with the world around us on a deeper level.
100%. And I also hope listeners come away with a deeper understanding of the complexities of exile, of identity, of memory, and the ways in which these themes have shaped not only Paraguayan literature, but countless other literary traditions around the world.
So it's about seeing the universality of these experiences, recognizing that even though these stories are rooted in a specific time and place, they speak to something fundamental about the human condition.
Exactly. And finally, I hope this deep dive inspires listeners to explore Paraguayan literature for themselves, to delve into the works of Casacha and Roa Bastos, and to discover the richness and diversity of this often overlooked literary landscape.
Now, that's a perfect segue into the last part of our deep dive, wouldn't you say?
Couldn't agree more.
Before we wrap up our exploration of Paraguayan literature, I want to circle back to something we touched on earlier, the idea of literature as a source of solace and connection, especially for those who have been displaced from their homelands. What are your thoughts on that?
It's powerful, isn't it? When you think about it, when you're cut off from your home, when home is more of an idea than a place you can actually go back to, sometimes all you have are stories.
It's like those stories become even more precious, more vital, when you've lost that physical connection to your homeland.
For so many exiles, literature becomes this lifeline, you know? It's a way to reconnect with those lost landscapes, to keep those memories alive.
So even if you can't physically go back, you can at least revisit it in your mind through these stories, through the shared cultural memory that's embedded in them.
Exactly. And that can be incredibly comforting, I think, especially in those moments when you're feeling lost or alone or disconnected from who you are. Literature can remind you of where you come from, what matters. It becomes this portable homeland you carry with you.
And in the case of Paraguayan literature, especially the works of Casacha and Roa Bastos, there's this added layer of shared experience, right? These writers understood exile on a visceral level. They weren't just writing about it, they were living it.
100%. And I think that authenticity, that rawness, it comes through in their writing. You can tell they're not just playing with ideas here. They're grappling with real lived experiences.
So it's almost like they're offering this roadmap, this guide, not just to understanding Paraguayan history and culture, but to navigating the emotional and psychological landscape of exile itself.
It's like they're saying, here's what it feels like to be uprooted, to be silenced, to be forced to start over in a world that doesn't always understand you. And in doing so, they create this sense of community, of solidarity that can be so powerful for readers who are going through similar experiences.
It's like their writing becomes this act of resistance, this way of reclaiming their power in a world that has tried to silence them.
Yes, exactly. And not just for them, but for anyone who's ever felt marginalized or silenced or forgotten.
It's a reminder that our stories matter, even, or maybe especially when they're difficult, when they challenge the status quo, when they make people uncomfortable.
100%. And I think that's a really important thing to remember, especially in today's world where it feels like everyone's trying to control the narrative.
Now, as we reach the end of our deep dive into the world of Paraguayan literature, I want to thank you so much for being such an incredible guide. I feel like I've learned so much, not just about Paraguayan literature, but about history, about culture, about the power of storytelling to connect us, to challenge us, to inspire us.
The pleasure was all mine, truly. It's been such a fascinating journey, and I hope our listeners feel inspired to continue exploring Paraguayan literature on their own.
Yes, definitely pick up some Casacha, some Roa Bastos, dive in, get lost in those worlds, and let those stories stay with you. Because I think they have a lot to teach us about resilience, about resistance, and about the power of the human spirit to endure, even in the face of incredible adversity.
And as you're reading, as you're exploring those themes, ask yourself, what does it really mean to belong? What are we willing to sacrifice for freedom? How can we use our voices to create a more just and compassionate world?
Those are powerful questions, and I think they're more relevant now than ever. So on that note, we'll leave you to continue your own deep dive into the world of literature. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep the conversation going.